Happy New Year. Since the New Year started, thank you all for filling the room today. I know it's been already a busy term, and I know everybody is snowed out as well, which is a surprise to me. Really excited for our first speaker of the new year. And as is tradition in our department, we have a graduate student, Tori Yang, who's going to do the formal introduction of Professor Duck. So I'll see the floor.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone, and I'm delighted to introduce you Dr. Waverly, our first speaker for this distinguished speaker series. Waverly is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and the most taught chair in the Professor of Sociology. Waverly is specialized in urban ethnology. He's the author of No Way Out, the first living in the shadow of poverty and drug dealing, and the finalist for the Society for the Study of Social Problems 2016. C. Wright Hill's book forward. His second book on unconscious racism, passive racism, was the 2021 winner of the Charles Gordon Book Award from the Society for the Study of Symbolic Interaction. 2021 honorable mention Mary Douglas Book Prize and the AIA Culture Section. The 2022 Book Award winner for the North Central Sociological Association and 2022 winner of the Oliver Cromwell Books Award for the AIA Section on Racial and Ethnic Minorities. Like his earlier work, his current research investigates the challenges faced by socially marginalized groups. His work is more directly concerned with the interaction order of the marginalized communities and how participants identify problems and what they think they are viable solutions. In today's talk, Waverly is going to talk about the Oasis, concentration of 7 local markets, which is a problematic in Waverly, a poor and working class black neighborhood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Waverly.
Thank you for that kind and lovely introduction. And I'm going to get comfortable because I'm going to go through a lot of stuff today. I want to thank the organizers and everyone who's responsible for bringing me here and even being patient when I was trapped in Santa Barbara because of the flooding. And what's sad is like when you're stuck in Santa Barbara, no one feels sorry for you. Never checked on me. But I can't express how long I've been looking forward to this talk. When I was originally contacted, I was really honored, and I was like, I have tons of talks that I could present, but this particular project is very near and dear to me, and it's actually coming to an end in the coming weeks in terms of writing everything up and telling a consistent story. This sign, there are black people in the future, appeared on top of a store in the East Liberty neighborhood of Pittsburgh. And this sign was meant to sort of affirm and engage the people who were being sort of pushed out of their neighborhood in various forms. And a lot of this sort of, push and pull movement was unintentional. But it still has these sort of devastating effects for communities. What I want to do, and I'm going to give you a snapshot, and I'm going to actually tell you what you're going to see in this talk very early on. And I'm going to go through it, and then I'm going to read some field notes, play a clip, and then attack your senses with pictures and stories from people. I started this project as one of the types of things you do when you're a new professor and you're so optimistic about the world and you want to change things. And I want, it doesn't end actually. I was like that when I graduated with my PhD, but then I was like, I'm a newly minted professor. And I was teaching urban ethnography, I was teaching urban sociology, and I was in a really interesting working class city, or a city that has some strong working class roots that was changing rapidly before my eyes. And one of the professors is a professor of computer science, Ron Garcia, lived around the corner from me, and he was my running buddy through some of these neighborhoods that I'm going to share today. But what I wanted to do was use this space as a way of teaching about development. And what was taking place was that housing was changing rapidly. An influx of people were coming in. We had a mayor who was really great and successful at reimagining Pittsburgh from this place that was really heavily manufacturing and steel to helping with the transition to sort of education, supporting the academic institutions. I think we all probably know about University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, but there's Carlow and Chatham and Robert Morris. So there's an academic center in Pittsburgh. But also sort of using those two institutions, whether it's medicine and technology at University of Pittsburgh Medical Center and artificial intelligence and robotics at Carnegie Mellon, to sort of use that to sort of reimagine Pittsburgh almost in a way like the Research Triangle in North Carolina. The point here is that this became a great opportunity to teach, to show students in real time that a lot of the theories that we developed as sociologists are really helpful as ways of thinking about the world. But they're also flawed. And, theory is just a particular way of thinking about something. And, here, I just would take students out and we would look at different neighborhoods, we would look at the people, the businesses, push and pull factors. And so this was a part of a longer project that had to deal with sort of the legacy of urban renewal, because a lot of those people who came in, particularly Black Americans in this particular space, lived in another neighborhood previously that was demolished because of urban renewal, which is the Lower Hill District. And what I'm going to do is something a bit strange and interesting at the same time. August Wilson, famous playwright, 9 of his 10 Century Series plays are set in Pittsburgh in the Hill District. So I'm going to pull in his work to show how he had an ethnographic lens and used sort of fact-based fiction to tell a story about a people in a place. I'm going to talk about this term, a food oasis, that was in initial conversation with this whole idea, this concept of food deserts. But when I started to talk to food activists, they found this, the notion of a food desert reductive, and actually that the idea of a food desert doesn't really get at some of the larger structural issues, like limited access to affordable housing and healthcare and livable wages, but it also distorts the food system has a structure to it, and there are a handful of actors who control most of the supermarkets in the United States. And so this idea that you can end up in a place, one of the, initially one of the poorest places in Pittsburgh, where they had 7 supermarkets, 7, within a quarter-mile radius of each other. So how does something like that happen? How does that uneven development happen? I am an interactionist. I am a very proud interactionist. I'm not an interactionist in the sense of a traditional symbolic interactionist. I'm an interactionist that comes out of an ethnomethodological and conversational analysis tradition. And pretty much what that means are what are people's practices and how they account for those practices. And how, as a community, when we all interact, how do we develop rules that are unique and specific to a place? It's can almost, if you can imagine, that UBC. But imagine if I came from University of California, Santa Barbara, was like, we have 1,700 social majors, we have it all figured out, I'm gonna give you guys some tips. Without even talking to you, without even trying to learn the culture, trying to figure out what your specialties are. And one of the things that happens in these communities is that people come in without really understanding sort of, the local people who live in these places for a long period of time, and then they're no longer recognized. You're walking, and now you're seen as, an outsider in your own community. So how do people resolve those clashing interaction orders? I am really interested in notions about gentrification, displacement, and resettlement. And I think that there are various ways of thinking about this, but there's an orderliness to it. And what I mean by that is that there is a way that, somebody who's been displaced because of a natural disaster versus economic development, or somebody who's reaching retirement age, or a community has been redlined in such a way that people are being pushed out. There are rules to why people end up in places, and I wanted to understand that. This is a loaded one here, because it could be, politics of representation, but also the importance of political representation. And what is this, who's allowed to tell this story? But here, before these people were displaced in this community, the argument was, if we had political representation, we could have prevented this from happening. And so now that it's happening again, it's like, what if we had political representation and property ownership? And I'll even talk about some of the complexities from there, and then I'll wrap this up. But I don't want this to be a gloom and doom story, because a lot of the people who live in these communities have really great solutions, not only for the people who remain in these communities, but for the people who are no longer there. And, as a researcher, what is my responsibility and what is my job? All right?
I know more.
Now, I'm going to read from one of my field notes, and I'm going to jump into the talk. On March 3rd of 2018, a billboard appeared above a store in the East Liberty neighborhood of Pittsburgh announcing, "There are Black people in the future." It caused a furor. Some white shoppers and new residents said they felt attacked by the sign on a local blog. They were in a Black neighborhood whose residents they had displaced. But when a local artist, Alicia Wormsley, was commissioned to create an aspirational piece to celebrate the original remaining Black residents, the new white shoppers and residents asked, "Aren't there any white people in the future?" That sentiment completely missed the point. It was beginning to look like there were only white people in the future. The sign, which was organized by a local professor of art at Carnegie Mellon University and involved an important local artist, was taken down in response to the controversy. East Liberty is a striking example of gentrification in the name of urban revitalization. This predominantly poor and working class Black neighborhood has 7 grocery stores, including Whole Foods, a Trader Joe's, Giant Eagle Market District, and a Target and a food co-op within a quarter-mile radius, even though there were already 3 supermarkets located in this neighborhood. This abundant access of food makes it an exception to the lack of access to food that characterize many poor Black neighborhoods more generally. How had one of the poorest neighborhoods in Pittsburgh become the site of a cluster of grocery stores, while wealthier communities, including the Oakland neighborhood where University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon are located, had none? And this is the whole thing, a mystery. And this sign is, that artist is engaging this whole, something that used to be in cultural studies and literature studies and coming out of Black studies about Afrofuturism, and I'll talk more about that in the talk. But I want to lay my cards out on the table that, to understand this uneven development, I really had to seek out people who had expert knowledge about not only the development, which included politicians and bankers. And it's very similar to what Harvey Muller would call the growth machine. But also there are things that we can't account for, like shadow marketing or shadow development. So when the success of this Home Depot became like one of the best performing, which was built first, became the best performing Home Depot, not only a state, but I later discovered in the country. And the success of that Home Depot led to the development of the Target and the Whole Foods. And so when Target and Whole Foods were being built in this neighborhood, Trader Joe's and Aldi, they built 2 stores. And then the local family that owns the Giant Eagle chain literally created a new supermarket chain called Giant Eagle Market District to compete with Whole Foods because they were a local Pittsburgh company. And then we already had the food co-op. What's interesting, all of these places are thriving and they appeal to different sensibilities. If you like prepared food or 100 varieties of cheese, or given your politics or you're vegan, there's something about these places that are thriving, but there's also a certain level of hostility that a lot of these stores and some of the customers have towards the people in this community where these stores were built. Now, getting in and methods, this is pretty much standard fare. I'm looking not only at the East Liberty neighborhood, but there are 4 neighborhoods that cluster together: Garfield, East Liberty, Lincoln, Larimer, but it's pronounced by locals Larmer, and the Homewood, Brushton neighborhoods. This is an ethnographic study, but it includes interviews, observations, participant observations over a 9-year period. Now, this 9-year period is important because this was used to teach, but also there were these mysteries. The first mystery is, the history of this neighborhood and the history of the people who live there and people being displaced, and teaching this in, various forms about food access and shopping in some of my classes. And so it's a 9-year study that sort of coincides with teaching, but also paying attention to this particular development. I wanted to do something very special because this is a story about Black Americans, and I wasn't the only one interested in displacement that was going on. So you have this artist who puts up this sign. You have a filmmaker named Chris Ivey who's filming and capturing people who are being moved from one place to another. There are small plays that are being written and performed. And so I also wanted to sort of engage this Black intellectual tradition of visual and performing arts, poets, playwrights, and fact-based fiction, because I think it adds to the story, and that my account isn't the only account. And one of the things that I think that's different about this project compared to previous projects or other projects that I've done in the past is talking to people who have a specific type of knowledge and understanding of a topic that I'm interested in. So politicians, developers, bankers, residents, of course, but also community organizers and community development corporations. So all of these are various ways that I'm seeking out people to understand what's going on in this place in this space. And of course, I'm curious, I'm a curious person. So, how are people making sense of these changes was the initial question. And then this idea about a food oasis was just in conversation with the notion of a food desert. And especially, there were already 2 instead of 3 grocery stores. There was the Food Co-op and the Giant Eagle Shakespeare. And how did this formation of a food oasis, what does that tell us about food apartheid? And one of the things I'll say, very early on, is that you still see health disparities. You still see people having limited access to buy food at these stores, but there's something else that's subtle. A lot of the stores like Trader Joe's and Aldi, because they have unfamiliar brands, and because a lot of working class and poor people would get unfamiliar brands in terms of governmental programs, those stores become some of these places that are dispreferred. So even the branding of it. But how do people make sense of these changes that are happening in their neighborhood? I really always, and I think, as any scholar and researcher, I want to problematize our notions about gentrification, displacement, and what I mean by the orderliness of displacement. Neighborhoods change over time, and a lot of people would say in interviews, I'm not opposed to middle-class people or people with resources moving into the neighborhood. It's, again, but under what circumstances and how do you engage and support the people who are there. And even the term displacement has been used in various ways to talk about gentrification and tying it to fear. And so it's, there's almost like this sort of broad brush that's being used. What I'm more interested in is, what is the orderliness of displacement? And to give you some examples, the Roma in Europe or Jews in Europe and America over time, Arabs, Muslims, Black Americans, tribal nations, First Nation persons, or people affected by natural disasters, and in this case, urban renewal. What were those rules and how did that shape life? That sign about there are Black people in the future engages in 2 streams of, 2 literary and cultural traditions. One, Afro-pessimism. And Afro-pessimism has changed over time. It used to be the case that anything from the continent of Africa, including people, was always seen as less than or presented as less than. And then it sort of morphed with the work of Orlando Patterson about almost like social death and labor. And what does it mean that your identity is in relationship to a master-slave sort of dichotomy? But also looking at anything that historically has been talked about as being Black, as a negative. And what sort of grew out of this were a conversation about Afrofuturism, using this very problematic history as a response to Afro-pessimism and a way of recognizing, not only anti-Blackness, but the resiliency and the creativity of people. And this is why art and music, and even now sociology, philosophy, are sort of engaging these ideas, because these are ways that people are resisting in forms of sense-making, but also being very much aware of how people have been made sense of in the past. We're all good? Clear? I'm talking about, bam, there were Black people in the past. What ultimately ended up happening? During urban renewal, there was a thriving Black neighborhood in Pittsburgh called the Lower Hill District. And something like, several thousand families, and I have it in the slide, were displaced to 5 neighborhoods. The 4 neighborhoods in the East End, so Garfield, Lincoln Larimer, East Liberty, and Homewood, and Hazelwood. And actually, August Wilson was displaced to Hazelwood. So there's an August Wilson house that exists in the Hill District, but there's secretly another August Wilson house that nobody really talks about. But I'm not the first person to sort of write about this and tell this story. Mindy Fullilove did a study about people who've been displaced from their neighborhood in Roanoke and Newark, and she looked at the Hill District in Pittsburgh. Talking to food activists, I've been really excited. Karen Washington, who works out of DC, pointed out how problematic the term food deserts are, and she says, I would rather say instead of food desert is food apartheid, because food apartheid looks at the whole system along with race, geography, faith, and economics. You say food apartheid and you get to the root causes of some of the problems around the food system. It brings in hunger, it brings in poverty, and it brings us to a more important question. What are the social inequities that you see, and what are people doing to erase some of the injustice? And why this is important is this last statement. What are some of the social inequalities that we see, but what are people doing? And I'm really interested in what people who live in this community, what are they doing to sort of resist and fight back? And that's one of the reasons I'm including some of these theoretical arguments. But I'm from an amazing discipline. Andrew Diener is a brilliant scholar and ethnographer, but he wrote this book that came out maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago, that really gets at the way that our food system in the United States is organized, and how it's structured, and how there are these corporate interests, and how supermarkets decide where they're going to build. And this is really significant. When the city of Pittsburgh decided that they were going to use this particular neighborhood to build supermarkets, it may seem like an unlikely place. But after interviewing the mayor, developers, community organizers, the assumption of the story that was told is that if you were to drop a pin where that neighborhood is located, it's actually in proximity to some of the wealthiest places in the state of Pennsylvania. So you have University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon, including their students to the south. You have really affluent neighborhoods of like Fox Chapel to the north. You have downtown to the west, and then you have this neighborhood called Penn Hills to the east. And so it's surrounded by wealth. And so this becomes one of the reasons. And so now you have cheap real estate, cheap labor force, and you're in proximity to wealth. And so if you can sort of build it, this becomes this place that sort of explains why we see some of the uneven development, but why there was a systematic reason why this location was selected. But I think it's important to pay an homage to the people who actually done this work before. So Ashanti Reese, I believe she's at UT Austin, goes to the history of food and race and sort of doing an ethnographic study about supermarkets and development in DC and how people have historically had unequal access to food. And Monica White points out even when blacks try to, do sort of self-sufficiency in farming, how they've been marginalized over time. And so there's always been this sort of interesting relationship with food that Black Americans have had. But here, and thinking about where those people have come from in the East Liberty neighborhood, in 1950 and all the way up into 2000, 1,000 acres were razed and 3,700 buildings were destroyed, and more than 1,500 businesses and almost 5,000 families were displaced due to the demolition of the Hill District. And what was put in its place, in addition to the expressway, was a ice skating rink. But this community was thriving. It was a part of Black life. And this is why the plays that you read with August Wilson talking about the Hill District is so powerful, because you have a sense of the thriving cultural way of life. That's the boxer Joe Louis at a baseball game in the Hill District. That's the famous performance artist, singer, dancer, actress Josephine Baker giving away an award in the Hill District. That's Diane Vaughn shooting shots. And I think one of the things that captures is like the jazz culture that came out of this. For those of you, the Alphas is one of the oldest Black fraternities. So they even had a basketball team in the Hill District. And Crawford Gabriel is what August Wilson writes about in most of his plays. And even kids are so spooky. They don't make costumes like this anymore. But people start to see things being torn down and closed, and even pointing out, no redevelopment at this point, lower income housing for the lower hill. But what was built in this place, expanding the freeway and building a skating rink that was meant for the ice capades. And I don't know what the equivalent today of the ice capades, Disney on Ice. And then the Pens played in this stadium, and it was the first retractable dome, and it only opened once and never opened again, and then it was demolished. And so here is a map of where those supermarkets are located. But one of the things that became very interesting to me is that, as people are pointing to the development and people being pushed out of their communities, one of the things that I've noticed as Pittsburgh is going through an economic decline is that people were leaving Pittsburgh already. And so, and you can sort of see the increasing number of, the population. So in 1980, there were 100,000 people in Pittsburgh. And then by 2015, 100,000 Black people in Pittsburgh. By 2015, while I was doing the study, it was like 72,000. But we can see that Pittsburgh, total population went from 423,000 to around about 305,000. And Pittsburgh, prides itself on being one of the most livable cities. And I can't take anything away from Pittsburgh. I absolutely love that city in undescribable ways, but for a host of reasons that are not obvious that I can get into later. But again, for the county, this becomes interesting. We talk about where people are going when they get pushed out. In 1980, there were 1.4 million people in the county, and then by 2015, around about 1.2. But we also see like the percentage of whites decreasing, so 1.2 million to a little under a million. But we actually see the number of Black people increasing in terms of the county numbers. So going from 10% of the county to 13% of the county. And even that comes with a certain set of problems. The larger point that I'm making here is that people have been slowly leaving this community over time. And I think that story needs to be accounted for. In addition to sort of the drastic movement that's happening in response to the economic development that's happening there. And so if we were to go to the various neighborhoods based on their census tracts, the Black population in 1980 goes from 4,000 to 3,200. And we're seeing similar drops with the white population, 69, but the point that I want to make is that these neighborhoods are predominantly Black. And so to go from 6,900 to 3,100 to 6,000 to 2,000 to 1,700 to 754 to 4,500 to sort of 3,000, you sort of capture that these neighborhoods, from their height of being these predominantly Black spaces, are slowly changing. And what I discovered in talking to people who live there, these various people who were in the know at a lot of these conversations, is that 12% of Pittsburgh's population, and a majority of those people were Black Americans, lived in public housing that was managed by a private company. So 92% of the inhabitants were Black. And this is really important because what are cities to do when they're cash strapped? So 75% of Pittsburgh's budget goes to fire safety and pensions. And during this period that I'm working on the study, when the public housing was demolished, 29,000 Black people were sort of temporarily displaced, but a majority of those people received the right to return. But why these 4 factors are significant and important. If you're a city and you want access to capital, one way you can improve your bond rating is to lower crime rates, raise median incomes, and raise median education levels. And even though public housing was in a state of disarray, and it was a place where a lot of property crime would take place. I'm sorry, I'm gonna quit moving. I'm sorry, I didn't know you. I'm gonna stay still for a while.
All good.
Okay. To get that higher bond rating and to get access to capital, this plan was sort of put in place, but it was also put in place to build better housing and, public housing where you couldn't really differentiate market rate housing from public housing. So the intentions were good, for the most part, but it had these unintended consequences. And so, like I said before, you had this wealth square of downtown and really affluent suburbs and universities. Real estate was really cheap. You had major roads and highways. But one of the things that I find really subtle here, and what I discovered is that, safety becomes a big issue. And all the supermarkets, except for the Trader Joe's, actually had an armed guard. But this area was a major business district between 1920 to 1960, before the rise of the shopping mall. The point here, again, how all these things are related is that there's a logic that actually works here. And all these places are thriving. But then there's this unintended consequence. One of the situations, you have, people coming into this neighborhood and they look and they, imagine, I can live here. And it's actually a pretty cool place to live. And then you end up buying properties and the property values showed up. And I don't think, again, this was anything that was intentional. And so again, there is this sort of understanding, but also the various ways that people are telling these stories. And even to be in Pittsburgh and watching a lot of this development and things go up. So these are the supermarkets. But remember I shared that there was a predominantly Black supermarket. And I want to stress something about the significance of a place. And I think this I believe a lot of us can relate to this. But imagine going to a place where you're recognized, if you're an older person or you have, some health concerns, you have a pharmacist who takes you for granted, the layout of the place, and slowly those things are being taken away from you. And what I am actually I'm in a bit of a sad, sort of gloomy mood, because when this field note was written 10 years ago, and I actually had to search for it, I was kind of moved, and I want to read this because it sort of predicts the future. So this resident's talking about the significance of the giant eagle on Shakespeare Street that was one of the two supermarkets located in this neighborhood. This place is a real gem. It is my #1 place to go for healthy, affordable, name brand food close to Oakland. Being a college student, it's very nice being able to use a $20 bill here and there to its fullest potential. But that's only half of what makes this place great. As a native girl from the Burgh, this giant eagle is about as true to the community of East Liberty as you can get. And no,
It isn't some newly gentrified East Side, East End version of the town. Don't come here expecting cheap Whole Foods. This is where you see the community in its most familiar form. There are still jitneys outside, for goodness sake, and even they're kind. You'll see them helping elderly people to their cars, even those who aren't customers. Inside, the kindness doesn't end. They give out free cookie cards to kids. The employees are helpful, but don't treat them like subhuman servants. They are real people and they'll let you know it. And I'm always greeted when I walk through the door by a nice security guard who I've never seen without a smile on his face. Now, I've shopped here for years, and when I was introduced to this place, to my roommate, I explained to her that the layout is, the key to the layout is memorization, because navigating the store won't work on common sense alone. But don't pass up this relic of the old neighborhood. You'll save yourself some cash and see a side of East Liberty that may not exist in a few years anymore. And that supermarket she was talking about was torn down 2 weeks ago. And I think it, and even saying, you can get your, the giant eagle across the street and sort of seeing this happen sort of captures that. And these other places, like there was a talk show out of CMU called the Waffle House, the Shadow Lounge, where artists like Mac Miller and Wiz Khalifa got their start, Jamil's The Bookstore, and even the sign that marks East Liberty is gone. But, all is not lost. Some of the young people who I've been working with, and I go into the community of Homewood and ask people like, you actually can go to this website, it's called iamhomewood.com. And so I had my students go in and we sort of did a reversal, like what types of research, what resources you would like us to do, and in regards to your community, and what do you see as viable solutions? And so we built a website, and my students worked on this, both my graduate and undergraduate students, but it was primarily the undergraduates who put this website together, and doing projects about crime and safety, economic development, education, environment and land use, health disparities, housing, labor, media, and even the understanding of how people are portrayed on the inside versus outside, restorative justice, and the school to prison pipeline. And it also captures what people are sensitive to and what they're dealing with, but also it was helpful for my students to have this really interesting asymmetrical relationship where the community is saying, this is what we want, and then we present that information, but also put it up on a website. And maybe if I have time, I can pull up the website that I think is still active from all of that time. But what resonates in terms of their solutions was really interesting. There wasn't this sort of, yes, there was some upset, people upset and angry about being displaced, but there's also kind of this understanding that, unfortunate but not surprising. Unfortunate but not surprising. And so now people are talking about, we really need to think about the development of the inner ring suburbs. And I think this is really significant insofar as you have this predominantly Black population that are filling up the inner ring suburbs around Pittsburgh that have predominantly white city governments, predominantly white school boards. And so how do you deal with issues along those lines? There is this sort of return to political representation. And Pittsburgh recently elected its first Black mayor, Ed Gainey, who my students actually did a report on when they were working on this project. And they told me, like, you shouldn't be so hard on politicians. And Ed Gainey was the example they use of a good politician. Talking about various types of attachment to place and space. So in addition to property ownership, thinking about co-ops, where that would really be difficult to get people to move. And then a community benefits agreement from the various businesses that are moving there to hire people from the catchment area, but not only the people who are there, but also the people who are no longer there. And I think, again, in thinking about this, and what I'll say is that, this interaction order argument gets at one thing about sort of interactions and sensibilities and how deals develop, and how to get a sense of, what are some of the challenges. But also, I think in terms of thinking about ethnography, as something where you explore, investigate, illustrate, that this, to sort of investigate and then evaluate how these things are taking place, it's really important and interesting to me. but also, something that was unintentional with regards to things that I necessarily wouldn't imagine with arguments like growth machine or how people were making sense, or even the idea of picking a place because of cheap property values and cheap labor and proximity to wealth becomes this sort of wonderful way of thinking about how, I don't think it's wonderful in a wonderful way, but like in a mad genius, like, now I'm gonna make some money sort of way. But the larger point here is that there is a very complex story, and it is one that I think is not only local to Pittsburgh, but in other parts of the country. I think there should be one more slide to this. There is a part 2 to the study that's using GIS mapping to map clusters of supermarkets to see if this pattern holds true in other parts of the country. And there is a longitudinal study looking at people who've been sort of displaced from the Hill District to this neighborhood and seeing how they're faring in terms of their health and economic well-being. So I'll stop there. That's it for this show. So I can take questions, and I'm gonna get a pen so I can write down. All right, questions? Yes.
Wow, that was terrific. The idea about interaction, classroom interaction orders at the level of the neighborhood, that kind of blows my mind. I hadn't really thought that far with the interaction framework. But in particular, I'm interested in how you talk about the racialization of private property through the uneven development. Not just grocery stores, but starting first and foremost with the Home Depot. So that clip that you had of the guy talking about bringing rich and poor together, that seems to be the initiator, right, to the whole process, right? Here in Vancouver, if you know the work of Zach Hyde, he's a graduate of our
What's the last name? Hyde?
Hyde, yeah. So he in Vancouver, it's more the issue, it's the trigger tends to be more housing, mixed housing developments, social housing with market housing mixed, right? And that seems to have a similar kind of gentrifying effect on various neighborhoods in Vancouver here. So the Home Depot thing, that is kind of the key piece of the whole of what you notice through the creation of the food Oasis, if that's right. And then if you could just say a little bit more about where the pockets of poverty, especially Black poverty, where those residual maybe ghettos or slums, or what's happened to them in this area itself.
So this is, should I stay here?
You don't
I'm
worry
gonna not
about
move
me.
anymore. I'm
No.
gonna stay here. Okay. Before I answer your question, there are a few things that I want to say. I think there is there is this this desire to to do something better. And anytime you build new housing, it takes years. And so even when they built public housing that looked like market rate housing, a lot of people are already settled and, did not want to come back. But there's such a shortage of affordable housing that it didn't take long to fill up those units. So even though the people who got, received the right to return, I think something, according to the director of housing in Pittsburgh, something like 10 to 15% of those people decided to come back and take them up on those offers years later. But moving is traumatic. The other issue is that there's still pockets of poverty in those surrounding areas. But one of the latent benefits is that a lot of development has happened in terms of building new houses. And so, there was, to see $1 million house, and property used to be really affordable in Pittsburgh. When I moved to Pittsburgh, my rent was something like $550 a month. I speculate that yours could not have been that drastically different. I don't mean to put your business on this. It was really affordable, and then it just, prices just skyrocketed. And so now where you could buy a house for $100,000 is now going for $500,000. And so it's creating all types of development in regards to housing, and even, new businesses are developing as well that's not related to the ones described here. And I think in terms of thinking about that Home Depot, I think there is something significant about the type of store that, I think food stores are, required for subsistence and living, and Home Depot is a very particular type of store, and there weren't any in an urban area, and its success exceeded everybody's expectations. And so I think there's this level of something that was unintended, because I think that was that we needed to fill that void. And then the other stuff came along, that was somehow decoupled, that became coupled with it because of its success. And so that as a part of, a type of development, it's almost sort of, I don't want to say unthinkable, but it did work. But I think there was an understanding that it had all the elements for a store to be successful. And so he had a theory, he had an argument, and it actually worked. And it worked so well that, all of those supermarkets are very close. I could walk to all of those places in less than 45 minutes, and they're still thriving because they appeal to people's different sensibilities. And I don't even know how to sort of understand it, that it's uneven according to whom. If everything is thriving, people are willing to come there, and they feel safe, and this is the place that they want to go. But the consequences, for the people who've been pushed out, and who are the people who are working in these places, and the other businesses that are benefiting from the sort of the revitalization of this community and this particular part of Pittsburgh. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
It does, but just, so what, you give us the raw statistics of where people are being displaced. I'm wondering where, say, black working class.
Oh, so they still live in proximity to this place, that even though the numbers have gone down, you still see small, and again, these are just numbers from the 2015 census. So you still see that even though the numbers have been drastically reduced in East Liberty to like 3,200 and going from almost 7,000 to 3,100, there's still people who are holding on living in that neighborhood. So it's not, you still will find some, pockets of, extreme economic inequality. And that was the other thing that initially started this. Even when people have access, like the poor people who live in proximity, even when you build it, they still didn't have access because the cost of things, and just it becomes a larger structural economic issue about healthcare and housing and livable wages. And so you still were seeing some of the health disparities before these supermarkets were built, and even after them being there now. Yes.
Thank you. There was so much complexity in your talk that I feel like my thoughts are going in lots of directions. But I wanted to make a comment and then ask a question. And I would just add on to Tom's point. I feel like you've made a kind of Home Depot effect, right? It's like establishing. It's interesting that Home Depot is not a food retailer. Anyway, it's really interesting, and I think the contrast between a food desert and a food oasis is fascinating, because I've read studies about neighborhoods that struggle for years to get a grocery store, and this is almost like this is what. Anyway, I don't know if it's like careful what you ask for, or obviously they weren't asking for this in particular, but it's a fascinating, it's a fascinating exception to what's often the object of study. So I have a very quick observation that's related to Vancouver, and then I'm going to ask you a question about your findings. And this, your account reminds me of a report that a community organization, actually from the Carnegie Center here, ironically, in Vancouver, it was a community-generated report about concerns about, in some ways it was about retail gentrification in the downtown east side in Chinatown. And one of the things that really struck me about the report was how it was, community members had produced this report, and they they literally stated that they would prefer, a lot of these were vacant storefronts, they weren't displacing existing businesses, they were actually vacant, but they were being filled by businesses that people felt that they could never afford anything in them. Like they felt completely excluded because of the kinds of things that were being sold and the prices. And they actually stated that they would have preferred these businesses stay vacant. And that just made me feel so sad. Like what a sad, it's like there's, so I guess maybe there's a question there about the challenges of economic and racially integrated communities. Like, it just made me feel really sad that that was the kind of solution they imagined, was just to leave the businesses boarded up, because the new businesses were just so, made them feel so unwelcome in their own community.
And I think that, I think at the core of this talk is about, people who no longer feel recognized in, a place that they call home. And there are people who are leaving, and there's definitely something happening. And one of the challenges, what your account reminds me of, instantly triggered sort of my memory of two films. One deals with actually someone who is writing about Trader Joe's, which Trader Joe's, out of all those supermarkets, was one of my favorites. And then I read this account, and I read this film note, and it was talking about how Trader Joe's creates a certain level of anxiety because of the unfamiliar brands, and then the aisles are really narrow, and you have all these bells. So there's one bell for a price check, two bells for workers who need to use their discount, and three bells to open up another aisle. But if you're someone who has sensitivity to all this, you find this place overwhelming, you don't feel welcome there. And that's what a lot of people were pointing out in these stores, that they go in and they're instantly being watched, and then the presence of so many armed guards, and there is a police presence that's there. I think it's very telling. I think there's a subtle thing that I think is unique as well. This is an account from somebody who bought a property there, who was like, I was shopping and I looked around and I could buy a house here. The point that I'm making was that initially it was to think about the commercial development, the commercial area, and not really focus on housing. And so you end up having people who are coming into these stores, who are looking around and seeing all of these services and amenities, and you're close to Carnegie Mellon and Pitt and downtown and to your wealthy neighborhood. And then you imagine, like, I can live here, and I can live here for a fraction. I can buy property here for a fraction of the price that I paid for the house in these other places. And so I think initially that is what happened, and it happened before in another part of Pittsburgh. The larger point to get at your question becomes, what would that business, and I think this, I am only projecting here, I don't know this for sure, but what would that business, what would that particular type of business, what would these businesses have to do to make people feel welcome? Do you hire people from the community? Do you have imagery? Do you engage? Do you have, people from the community on economic boards? All of these are ways that I think, the question becomes, what would make you feel welcome at this space? And I think those are the conversations that are happening now. And so I think that's the point of it. But then when you have incidents where the sign goes up and people get really upset about this sort of bringing attention that there are Black people in the future. And this sign has popped up in places like Detroit and Newark and Baltimore. So it's being used in a host of ways, but I think that, people are, acknowledging that they're not being recognized and that they're being very critical of some of these places. But also, I don't think some of these businesses are taking into consideration, the locality and the contours of the place like they should. And I think some people are being responsible to it now. What that's going to look like, I think, will come out what those activists and young people are doing in terms of pushing back against some of this development. But also holding the university and the city accountable, because they're part of it. And this was made clear about my role when I was doing this project. So, Other questions? Yes.
So I'm actually from Pittsburgh.
What? Oh my God!
It's interesting because my mom is my mom's not particularly interested in my work, which would be super interested.
I love it. I love it. I love it. I love it. No, I'm sorry. I don't. But I love that you're mom. I'm happy. I don't know if you can see this. I literally have goosebumps when you say you were from Pittsburgh. So now.
So these might be two Pittsburgh specific questions, but I'm wondering about the farmers market, right? Because East Liberty has a big farmers market. And also too, think about that. There's dramatic shifts with Lawrenceville, and they seem to be very different. And if you have any thoughts about that, in how the different parts of town.
Yeah, so the farmers markets are still happening across from the Home Depot in East Liberty, and there's one in Squirrel Hill. So, and it's interesting. And what I would say to you, and what I discovered is the reason these supermarkets are thriving is that people have politics and sensibilities about food that governs, how they shop if they have choices. And this is fascinating to me. And so I personally, and I didn't think about it, I didn't like going to the other supermarkets because there was an armed guard, and I felt that what a horrible way to harm someone trying to steal, if somebody's there to steal food, but the food being the access. But what the global thing is that you learn that people, when they have your choices are only as good as your options. So if you have choices, you don't want to support corporate supermarkets, you can go to the food co-op. Or if you want to go 100 varieties of cheese, I speculate your mom would know this about Giant Eagle Market because that's what they're known for, having 100 varieties of cheese. Or if you like prepared food, or most of the college students, because they're food insecure and having economic issues, we're dumpster diving, but primarily shop at Aldi. So it's even the sociology of the supermarkets and the customers. And I speculate the farmers market is one of those things that, again, it appeals to your sensibility, and this is why it's thriving. And there is some truth to it that this becomes this sort of magnet place where people can go and do all of this one-stop shop for all your food needs. The Lawrenceville example. Lawrenceville is fascinating because I think when housing was taking off, that becomes one of those places where I think people really could see the potential. And I think it was pretty much predominantly like a lot of white development that was happening. And working class whites were pushed out across to Midville. Is it Midville? I don't know. It's a town right across the bridge called Millville or Midville. But it is prone to flooding. And so even you sort of see that there are these racial and class lines. Like, people in Pittsburgh know the price of things. And so there were a series of apartment buildings were being put up that were charging $2,000 a month. And local Pittsburghers were like, I'm not paying that. And so it's not only, what's interesting, it's not only affecting poor and working class Black Americans, it's affecting poor and working class white Americans. And I don't think people see the people who are being pushed out, in these different boundaries of how they're being impacted. And so Midville, I hope it's Midville, but I'll check, is this place that's going through an economic boom, but it is surrounded by floodplains. And it's definitely it's inevitable that it's gonna happen. But again, this type of thing that happened residentially versus commercially, and then looking at East Liberty where it's happening not only commercially, but also it has flooded over to the residential part. I think what's happening in Lawrenceville actually was the reverse of this process. So it started residentially, then the commercial business started taking off. And so even, that's great. That would be a great comparison for somebody. You get the goosebumps. I'm gonna pitch this to a student. Like, you know what you should do. Talk about these two different types of development. But I did, what I was referencing, like it happened in another neighborhood. I think the residential development took off in Lawrenceville. Then a lot of the commercial development sort of brought, there was new life that was built or brought into those buildings. So, and I speculate, I don't know this for sure, but I speculate that the racial composition of why the development happened residentially first, then commercial second, has a racial component to it. So, other questions? I could take a nap, I'm okay with that. Or I could have some coffee. Let me just say this. I love being here. I mean, not love like a romantic love, but I've been looking for it, and it finally happened, and I was prepared for failure, like that there was going to be a flight canceled, but everything went well. And I'm here, and I've been thinking about this, and why it's kind of surreal is that I'm finally bringing this project to a close, and I didn't want to. I was so hoping that Giant Eagle, it's called Giant Eagle Shakespeare, that store was going to last, that it was going to survive. But deep down, I knew it wasn't, and it's just the way that people, disappointed but not surprised by this. It's unfortunate and it's sad. And so, and what I would say to anybody who's interested in ethnography, there's like these mysteries, endless possibilities. It was, I just wanted to talk about uneven development, and then it turned into this whole thing about Afrofuturism and literature and place and space and urban renewal and gentrification and thinking about the orderliness of how people and the push and pull factors and, and challenging my sensibilities and even thinking about, agency and power. Here, everyone's in the food chain. You're a cash-strapped city and you don't have enough taxes coming in to support, the things that you want to do. Most of the budget is being, gobbled up by fire safety and pensions, and you need to increase your bond rating. And so understanding these rules about it. But then if you're a resident, you organize and start, pushing back and saying, holding not only the city accountable, but the businesses who are coming in and the nonprofit culture, and protesting and marching and organizing people in other, types of housing as these sort of, these ways of, as a local citizen, challenging, people who have resources and positions of power, but also how people who are in, politics and city government actually have really great intentions. Like a lot of them were like, we're gonna give people new housing. This is gonna be great. But then nobody, I was supposed to wait 5 years. And that's the thing. It's, a lot of these are great ideas on paper, but when they work out, and, and people would say they love the way the neighborhood looks. But then when you see people getting arrested and you see that, in this predominantly Black space that most of the workers are white, a picture develops. And so there's some animosity. And what I would say as an ethnographer, and somebody who worked on the study, and who was very fortunate to talk and have students and scholars and activists and politicians to be kind enough to talk to me, is that, there are no heroes or victims. Everybody's trying to do their best. And that what I was surprised by, that there's this sort of concern, not only for my social situation, but I was really moved by, what about the people who are no longer here who are in the struggle? It's fascinating to me, and so, even, at this point in my career, I'm doing some really fun and exciting stuff. Like I have enough stuff to keep me busy for the next 20 years. But that being said, everything is still like, you just still learn and there are new discoveries and it challenges your sensibilities and, and you're able to engage in people who can get to sort of things that have happened over time, people who are expert at GIS mapping and mapping where, things occur, following people where they actually have been displaced and how many actually come back and, whether they're happy or not, if they can survive, or even if the quality of life hasn't, increased. But I think the larger issues that people still point out is that there's still a shortage of affordable housing. People are still not making livable wages. They still have limited access to health care. And, and they're still heavily under surveillance. And so all of those things are some of the structural issues of why people in the face of a food oasis still don't have access to healthy food.
So I'm gonna actually ask a question I was originally gonna ask, but I thought you guys would have lots of questions, so.
Last question.
Last question. So, your numbers here, they show this overall decline.
And one is this one instance, yeah.
Residents. And so I guess what I'm wondering, as you sort of answered this actually, which is, as you were giving your talk, I was thinking, are we talking about business displacement or residential displacement, and you just noted that you started with an interest in the displacement of businesses, but the residential has followed it. Has that continued, or is there now residential being added? Like, if we had the 2020 numbers, would we actually see the population growing, or is this just a neighborhood that's being converted into a kind of retail center?
I mean, I think this is interesting, and I could look at those numbers again to see what happened, because there was some new housing built in East Liberty as I was leaving a year ago. Not East Liberty, Homewood. And so I think you'll still see a decline in, I speculate, this is pure speculation. Anybody who, the closer you live to that development, the lower you're going to see in terms of Black residents. And the further you get the neighborhoods, that's the furthest away, like Homewood, is probably where you'll see the slowing of it, actually a repopulation of Black residents. That's my hypothesis, and I'm going to look up these numbers. What is your name? I don't see you.
Oh, I'm having lunch with you. So.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to get back to you on this one.
I have lots more to talk about.
This is great, because this is actually something to think about. I think this is the second part of the story. So yeah, I could look at it. I have access to that information, so I don't know why not. So
We do have a question from the chat if we
Oh.
have that.
Well, I mean, this ends now, because a lot of people have like 12:30 class. So.
Alright, sorry, Nathaniel, all good.
I'm sorry, chat people. What was it, or is it an easy? I can, if you email it to me, I'll answer.
I'll send it to you with Nathaniel's email.
Okay, perfect.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Corrigal-Brown, the head of sociology at UBC. Thanks for watching our video. To learn more about UBC sociology, please subscribe.